I didn't like my husband's porn use at first, but I guess I don't really care now, as long as it's kept on the down low, and I don't know about it. I really don't care. It's not cheating in my book. It's a natural instinct that Christians really try to harp on, and it's just not really my biggest concern. Well, that's a quote from Julia, who goes to a Methodist church, and it's in the book Addicted to Lust, where author Samuel Perry talks about how conservative Protestant Christians have responded to the issue of pornography. And today I want to talk about what happens in a Christian marriage when pornography is a part of the marriage. And this is part 5 in the series, where I'm looking at each and every one of the chapters in this book. Part 4 was Every Man's Battle, really talking about the issue of how pornography is something that Christian women struggle with as well, and how do Christian women respond to that issue. And this is part 5, and if you want to catch the next few episodes, each one is being released Thursday, 9:15 a.m. Eastern. So far, I've been fascinated with this book because Samuel Perry takes an outside the box look at the church. He's not a Christian, but he's researching conservative Protestant Christians, doesn't even seem to hate Christians, and I think the data in this book is amazing. But when it comes to pornography in the Christian marriage, it is something that can be devastating, and I know that firsthand. It's something that I brought into my marriage, and some of the hardest conversations I've ever had to have with my spouse had to do with the issue of pornography. And so what does this research and the interviews from this book show? Is pornography okay in a Christian marriage? What are the impacts in a marriage when either the husband or the wife is struggling with this issue? Could there be a positive benefit to finding out that this is in the life of your marriage? And then if it is, what should we do about it? And this series is sponsored by Covenant Eyes. Covenant Eyes provides internet monitoring and accountability, both on tablets, computers, and smartphones. I've been using Covenant Eyes for over 15 years. It was a huge part of my recovery process of getting pornography out of my life. Definitely want to recommend you check it out if it's right for you or your family. There's a link in the description. You can try it out for 1 month free. Pornography use, not always but on average, seems to have a deleterious influence on the quality and stability of romantic and family relationships. These effects are far worse for conservative Protestants than for other Americans. And again, I think that makes sense. Now, when I did the episode on the war of the soul, and as the research is showing that Christians who have pornography in their life have a much bigger problem with it than non-believers. And to me, that makes sense. We are violating the scriptures, we're violating our conscience, and if the Holy Spirit is active inside of us, then we should have a war of the soul. We should have a conscience telling us this is not something that should be in the life of somebody who wants to actively follow Jesus. And when it comes to a marriage, if you are going to fill your mind with the naked bodies of other people, how will you then be ready to give and devote yourself, to reserve your sexuality for your spouse? Think of all the things that this is then going to introduce into the marriage. Now there's comparison and there's some body shame. I mean, as most of our bodies do not look like the surgically enhanced and photo altered images and videos in pornography. This can then lead to a lack of interest in your spouse. This is going to bring a whole bunch of things into your marriage that overall are not going to be positive. And I think God's design for marriage is actually beautiful, that you are supposed to reserve everything that you have sexually for your spouse, both in your thought life and with your actual body. We're trying to completely save it for our spouse. In fact, there's a very graphic imagery in the book of Proverbs when he talks about the issue of adultery. And the book of Proverbs says this: "Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the street." And here we have an analogy of your sexual drive being spilled out all over the place. Well, how could that be in the confines of that marriage a beautiful thing if it's just being spilled out and given to everyone? Now, of course, we are sinners. We're not able to do this perfectly, but that's where the gospel comes into a Christian marriage. Where the gospel comes in, the gospel's for sinners, and we're able to apply the gospel to these struggles we have. And hopefully the gospel will then also, in that freedom and grace, give us the power to live a new life, to completely eradicate pornography from our lives. So what does the research actually show about what are the impacts of having porn in your marriage? Well, he says the findings that men, and sometimes but not always women, who use pornography tend to report lower relationship quality is one of the most consistent findings in all of pornography research. To put it bluntly, pornography is not making your marriage better. He gives no positive indication to say if you introduce pornography for the husband or for the wife, it is going to make things better, or even if you view it together. He talks about that as an option as well. And all that to say, here's the reality. Marriage is hard. Sexual intimacy is hard. Maybe you would say right now your marriage is not where you'd want it to be, but pornography is not going to make it better. Maybe you would even say, hey, you've given up having the type of sexual relationship in your marriage that you would like to have. And so you've veered and you've fallen into pornography. Well, that is not going to provide the solution that you're looking for. Just take a second and dream. If pornography is a part of your marriage, what would it be like to completely eradicate that? To have a marriage where you're fully focused and reserving and holding your sexuality completely for your spouse. Imagine what type of intimacy that could create. Now, it certainly isn't an easy path, but just dream a little bit about what that could be like. Also, with your relationship with God, think about your walk with God. What would it be like to say to Him, no matter how difficult it is, you want to honor your vows in your marriage. You want to walk in holiness and integrity, mind, body, and soul, to reserve yourself for one. Pornography is not going to help you get there. It's kind of like a microwave dinner when what you want is a handcrafted, delicious steak and potatoes meal. And so one of the quotes he has here on page 120, he says, porn use is never linked with positive marital outcomes. And again, this is not a Christian resource, and Samuel Perry is not writing from a Christian perspective, but the research shows there is not positive outcomes from introducing this into your marriage. But that really kind of brings up the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Does porn introduce unhappiness in a marriage, or do people who are unhappy in their marriage tend to move toward pornography? And the answer to that question is really probably both. So he says qualitative interviews suggest that frustrated partners or spouses do indeed seek out pornography as a source of release or escape. I'll even go a little bit farther, because I've heard people use their struggles of intimacy in their marriage as an excuse to then go and fall into pornography. For example, the recent scandals that hit Ravi Zacharias over the last year or so, and RZIM Ministries, and I did a number of videos covering that. It was a huge scandal at the time, but one of the people commented on one of my videos, where was his wife? And in this comment, they were indicating it's his wife's fault. His wife obviously wasn't satisfying his needs, or he wouldn't have went and done all these horrible things. To which I would immediately respond, even if you have a terrible spouse, your spouse is never an excuse for your sin. So my spouse can never be an excuse for me to run and sin. Now, your spouse could be a complicating factor. Don't get me wrong. I mean, if your spouse is treating you a certain way, that's a complicating factor, but it is never an excuse for sin. You go all the way back to Genesis. In Genesis chapter 3, Adam blamed God. Adam blamed his wife for why he ate the fruit. So this is not the blame game in marriage. You cannot blame your spouse for your behavior. You see, we must stand before God. And let me challenge you, take a page out of Joseph's book, again in Genesis in chapter 39. When he was getting tempted by Potiphar's wife to have an affair with her, Joseph said this, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So I want you to take responsibility for your behavior before God and say, to dive into pornography is not excusable because of your wife or your husband's behavior. You stand before God and you are responsible before Him to walk in a way that is pleasing to Him. Your marriage or your sex life right now may not be what you would like it to be, and hopefully it can get better, but it is never an excuse for sin. I love 1 Peter 2:16. It says, "Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God." But one of the things that this really points out, this entire chapter should prove to us with the research, that marriage does not eliminate sexual temptation. And I think that's a myth that we have got to completely get out of the church, that idea that, okay, you've got sexual temptation, you've got sexual struggle. Once you get married, that will go away. Now, listen, I'm all for marriage. I think people should get married. I think marriage is wonderful. Marriage can certainly help sexual temptation, because marriage does give you an outlet, somebody to pursue, somebody to move with your sexual drive. That's a positive, but it will not fix sexual addiction. It will not fix sexual idolatry. It will not cure a pornography addiction. And I think here's why. Porn is a way to numb the pain in your life. So if you have a habit of running to porn when you're lonely, when you're hurt, when you're stressed, when you feel rejected, well, marriage has the potential to be one of the most painful things that you go through. Because what are you going to do when your spouse rejects you? What are you going to do when your spouse isn't in the mood? What are you going to do if they say some mean and nasty things to you? You get a sense of rejection. Do you then immediately run back to pornography? And I think he's got a lot of interviews in this chapter that talk about that people that felt a sense of rejection and they would run to pornography to medicate their pain. So he says several husbands described how marriage actually made their struggle with pornography worse. Marriage didn't end up being the holy grail that I thought that it would be. Well, marriage is never promised to be the holy grail. In fact, marriage is two sinners coming together, and now what do you have? You have two sinners. Okay, so marriage can be profoundly painful, and pornography presents itself as a way to medicate and to numb that pain. And the other thing that you can really do is oftentimes it can be tempting to use pornography as a way to get revenge on your spouse. You may say, well, if you're not going to meet my needs in this way, if you're going to do this, then I'm going to do that. And so we're using our spouse as an excuse to run to something like pornography. So I thought this chapter was extremely good, but it really does bring up the question of, well, then what do you do if pornography is a part of your marriage? And I would just say this can be incredibly difficult. If you found out that your spouse, either your husband or your wife, has pornography in their life, this can be devastating. I mean, and I would view it as cheating. It is violating your marital vows. And so you feel violated, and there's a sense of shame and a sense of brokenness from that. And as I said at the beginning of this video, it's something that we experienced in our marriage as well. Some of the hardest conversations I've had was confessing that sin to my wife. But this is where I bring up what I said at the very beginning. Could there be a positive benefit to this? Well, the positive benefit to this would be it is a tremendous gospel opportunity, because now you are presented with needing the gospel, whether it's in your life or the life of your spouse, living out the gospel for your spouse. If your spouse has hurt you in a deep and a profound way, you have the opportunity now to forgive them for sinning against you, to apply the gospel to them in the same way that God provides the gospel to us. But what also I would say as well is that you don't need porn. You don't need porn. Your spouse doesn't need porn. Don't let your spouse convince you that they need pornography. If they don't get this, then that. That is absolutely not true. Bringing porn into the marriage is cheating on a spouse. It is not something that you need. It is not something that is going to lead your marriage to any sort of positive outcomes. In marriage, we vowed to save ourselves for one, and introducing pornography is a violation of that vow. And I would say about abstinence, in 1 Peter 2:11, we're challenged to abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul. That abstaining is as much a physical as it is a spiritual discipline, that we are trying to hold back our flesh from wanting to run to sin. It really is a war of the soul. Nothing about it is easy, but the scripture never tells us that living the Christian life would be easy. So that should be our expectation. So my challenge to you would be this: do whatever it takes to eliminate pornography from your marriage. If you're hiding this is something that you're living a secret life of having this pornography in your life, let me challenge you to bring it into the light. Now, if you're going to make a confession to your spouse, it may be wise to bring another couple that you respect inside that can help you make that confession, so that your spouse will have accountability and support while they're going through this restoration process. But the biggest challenge here I would give you is this, and that is that hiding will not lead to healing. So to keep this hidden is not going to lead to greater intimacy in your marriage. It's not going to lead to honoring God, and it's really not going to lead to you getting better. It is very rare that people heal from an issue of pornography by hiding it. But if your spouse is the one who has brought this into your marriage, they really need your support in this restoration process. Can you find it in your heart to forgive them, to apply the gospel to them? Now, there may need to be some consequences. You may need to be removing some electronic access. Obviously, that is a huge violation of trust, so I'm not saying you immediately go back and trust them, but can you bring some folks in to help you in that process of restoration? Grace can be such a huge part of the restoration process. I think my wife's graceful response in my life did more to apply the gospel in my heart and soul than anything before that. She forgave me and was willing to love me still in the midst of my sin and my brokenness. You may need to get some counseling into your life. You may need to get into a small group. I'm a huge fan of small groups, and one of the things that churches need to provide is small groups that can discuss this openly. This cannot continue to remain a taboo in the church, because one of the things that does is it prevents couples from bringing into the light, getting help in this area. But I believe getting help makes the upside in your marriage huge. There's a lot of potential for your marriage to improve. But let me point you back as I end this video to Covenant Eyes Resources. Now, I talked about the accountability software that they provide, but they also have a number of free ebooks, both for marriage and for how do you handle betrayal and confession of your spouse. How do you go about confessing to your spouse? So they've got issues of marriage, also parenting, and a number of free resources for how you can get pornography out of your life. Well, next week, we're gonna be talking about what actually works when it comes to eradicating pornography from your life. That's the next episode in this series covering Addicted to Lust. Definitely let us know in the comments section, how do you see pornography affecting Christian marriage? Subscribe if you want to see that next episode. This is Jason for Soulfire. Here in this channel, we want to offer gospel hope for a porn-filled world, reminding you that integrity is possible. Now, it's not easy. Honoring God in your marriage, definitely not easy, but it is possible. I'll catch you in the next one.